And then this is dry dock number 2. In dry dock number 3, they tore apart the Solon turbine, and I think maybe there's some parts of it still in there.
Great.
But the guy that's in charge of that program, who probably would be the most helpful, if he's not there, somebody else can help you.
Right. Okay, so you want to know what they're doing, the procedure for removing the old lead base and put on new?
If that's actually occurring, and whether or not they're wearing protective equipment while they're doing that.
Well, yeah, everybody wears protective equipment these days.
But back in the day.
Yeah, I don't know about back then, but today everybody does. That's absolutely. As far as removing it, what you do is you blast it, you water blast it at about 5,000 psi, and it breaks down to what you call white metal, and then you paint it with newer, approved paints, of course. It's a two-step process because the ship is actually in dry dock, which means it's sitting on blocks, and so you do not have access to where the blocks are. So you need to do probably 95% of the ship, then you have to refloat it, move it, and then resync it onto the blocks, and then do those spots that were missed. But other than that, it's fairly straightforward and simple.
But is that occurring currently?
Is it occurring? Not as we speak, but it is a procedure. It's a service that we offer, yes.
Is there any hazard for the water in the area or any of the marine life in the area? Do you know from like the runoff of what's been sprayed off the ship? Or?
Yeah, no, because we do all of our work inside of a dry dock.
Okay.
And the dry dock is like a great big bathtub, and so all of the chips will fall to the floor of the dry dock to where they're swept up, bagged, and disposed of as a hazardous material. Should you get a worst case catastrophe, so to speak, you get a breach in the hull of the ship while water blasting it, and you start to pour out hundreds and hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel, it too will be contained in the dry dock. It may take a long time to remediate the dock itself, but it will never enter the environment. That's the whole beauty of the dry dock.
Great. And we saw one of those, I think it was on Shipyard 2 maybe? It was farther down one of the dry docks, I believe.
Yeah, you saw the empty one down there?
Yes.
Yes, that's dry dock number 1. That was built right around the Civil War.
Oh.
What about epoxy coatings?
What about it?
Do you know anything about whether or not they're still using epoxy coatings, or if they've started using alternatives to that?
I don't know.
So currently, are there any ships in the process of getting remodeled, or?
No, we're not. We have bid on some ships to do exactly what you're talking about, to remove old paint, put on new paint. We have some contracts pending, and if that work comes out, we'll let you know. And if you're interested, you'll see it in the paper, you can come by. But that won't be towards the end of this year.
And that World War II ship, do you know if that still has lead-based paint or epoxy coatings?
Which one?
The Lincoln?
Yeah.
That's not World War II. That was built in 1960, and yes, it does.
Does have both epoxy lead-based, and is that going to get redone?
No, that ship is going to be sold for recycling. So the metal itself, with the paint adhering to it, will go into a furnace to where it's melted. Lead melts and becomes reused. It will be reused for new products that we're still using for lead. The steel, you put them in together, lead being heavier than steel will sink to the bottom, and the steel will rise to the top, and other alloys will be blended in as well. For example, you might find some aluminums or coppers, and they'll all find their own levels to where they get drained off, and then reused back in, through recycling. And this is all done in certified approved furnaces.
Do they have those on Mare Island? No. Interesting.
And are there any workers still working with lead-based paint or epoxy coatings?
Not to my knowledge. Not in this country. I don't know.
So they have not been using lead-based paint at all?
No, God, no, I don't think they've used it since the 70s, to my knowledge.
And what about epoxy coatings?
Epoxy is a pretty broad term. I'm not sure exactly what you mean. I mean, they sell epoxy at Home Depot right now.
It's what they put on the outside of the ships to keep it like water resistant.
Right, but it's a broad spectrum of items, and I'm sure they're still using some sort of sealant because it would be required. and they may call it epoxy, but you're probably thinking of things that contain PCBs. That was a common substance in epoxy.
Right.
Yes, those are completely outlawed. I'm not using those either. And, yeah, when we strip the paint, oftentimes that paint is contaminated with PCB. Possibly was in the epoxy, or as well as in the paint. They did blend PCBs and paint during the 40s and 50s.
And is there a specific protective equipment that's required to wear during that?
Oh yeah, they wear everything. The mask, breathing apparatus, personal air tester that samples. Then they have to be surrounded by air testers that constantly grab samples. It all goes in for testing. Blood. They get blood testing. They get their blood work before they start work. Then they get blood work throughout the job. They're wearing masks, gloves, shoes, booties. It takes them an hour to get dressed.
Is that something that is just done that you practice, or is that something required by law? Because the law seems pretty loose in terms of open to interpretation. Because it's like it always says like when acceptable or when allowed, or so that's just something specifically that you require here.
We just assume the worst case scenario and apply it.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, it's comforting.
That's comforting.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about the paints that were used, or?
Oh, my mind wants to remember it. Of course, the anti-fouling paint on the bottom was always controversial because it seeps into the waterway to prevent the marine growth from forming on it. And so they had a lab here, an industrial lab, and they were doing a lot of research on different paints. And the problem is the marine growth, the barnacles and the slimes attach, and that markedly slows the ship down. And so there is constant struggle to find something that will discourage the growth. And back in those days, it was almost copper oxide was the poison for the marine growth. But that ablates into the water fairly quickly. And so every few years you had to redo it, otherwise the marine growth would go berserk. But that leaves a residue, of course, in the water.
Right.
And today we've got much more sophisticated things that discourage marine life, discriminate, and doesn't upset the environment so much. The other thing, I don't know if you're aware of, but in the submarine, it's a closed atmosphere. So you have to be worried about everything that can vaporize into the atmosphere because you breathe it after a while, whether it's harmless, detrimental to your health or not. And then in the nuclear submarines, we added cleaning devices called CO2 burners. Take carbon monoxide and burn it, and clarify the air. And then we have oxygen generators that add oxygen, so you can sustain breathing continuously in there. But one of the things that became kind of humorous and famous in this would have been in the early 60s. They discovered that, and so when you reported to a submarine, you could not bring you were inspected, your duffel bag was inspected if you had shaving cream in it. Because one of the compounds in the shaving cream that make it volatile got into the air, and when through the high temperatures of the CO2 scrubbers, it created phosgene gas. And so smoking, shaving cans were forbidden. Cans were forbidden, still are forbidden on submarines because of that. Strangely, we didn't worry about smoking. half the crew were incessant smokers, and so that was always in the atmosphere. And one of the things, the smoking contaminants are positive ions. I'm sorry, negative ions. And if we didn't clean the air properly, you could build up negative ions. And that makes us very angry kind of people. It's irritating to us as humans. And so the crew would get very restless with each other. And I was the damage control officer. That was my job, to keep the atmosphere clear. He would come and say, hey, what's wrong with the readings? And so we'd have to take a readings to see what the negative ions were in the atmosphere. And there were things you could do to cut it back. One of the another hard lesson we learned was that we liked Formica because it looked nice rather than steel and paint stuff on the walls. So there was a period when we lined everything with Formica, kind of wood grain appearance. It made it kind of homey and things. But then we had a fire, and when that burns, it creates a toxic gas. And so within months, we had to take all the Formica off submarines.
So between the Formica and the shaving cream and
a lot of
the
lessons learned.
Smoking and
the bottom of the ship
Yeah.
paint leaking.
Aren't you glad I'm still here?
Yeah,
very much so.